Starting from this video, we're going to discuss modeling techniques using spline as the base object. So, what is actually spline? Well, if you used Adobe Illustrator before or Inkscape or use Path inside Photoshop before, you have used spline before. For those of you who never used them before, you don't need to worry because we're going to discuss this from the very basic of it. Okay? Splines are a bunch of vertices or points connected with curves. These curves can be straight lines or can also be bending curves. Each of the vertices can have control handles, so we can control the shape using them. The difference between vector drawing and spline in 3ds Max is that in 3ds Max the vertices can have x, y, and z coordinate values, while in Illustrator or in Inkscape, they only have x and y, as it is basically a 2D application. Just like geometry objects, spline objects can be primitives and can also be editable. In 3ds Max, the editable type of splines are called editable splines. For example, we can create a circle by going to the Create panel, Shape, Spline, Circle. Just click and drag on the viewport to create a circle. When we go to the Modify panel, while the circle is selected, we can still change the radius, but we cannot access the sub-objects of it as it is still a primitive object. To convert to uneditable, we can right-click, Convert to, and choose Editable Spline. Now, as we can see, we can access vertices and other sub-objects of the spline. Another example, we can create a rectangle and go to Modify panel. We can still change the length, the width, and the corner radius of it. Now, after converting this to an editable spline object, we can now access its sub-object. The same concept also applies to other spline in here, such as ellipse, arc, donut, etc. Perhaps only one spline object is different from the rest, and that is line. Because when you create line object, it will be automatically become an editable spline object. Watch when I create a line like this and go to Modify panel. I can access the sub-objects and other spline editing features right away. Okay, now before we move on to the next video, there are two things we need to know. First is the rendering setting and second is the interpolation setting. By default, when you try to render splines, they will not render or not visible in the rendering result. If you want to make splines visible in the rendering, we can set this in the rendering panel. In the rendering setting, we can enable this both in rendering and in viewport. Spline will be displayed as it was geometry. When this option turns on, we can now set the spline display, whether it will be displayed as the radial base, which basically looks like a pipe, or it can also be displayed as rectangular base, which makes it looks like a wall. If it is set to radial, we can set the thickness, sides, and angle in here. If it is set to rectangular, we can set the length, the width, etc. In interpolation rollout, the steps value controls how many virtual points will be created to accommodate the curvature of the spline. If I set this, for example, 0, notice no curvature is created as there are not enough points to generate it. Higher value means smoother result but more resource intensive. The optimized setting will reduce the virtual points automatically when the spline is straight. And the adaptive mode in here will let 3ds Max automatically adding virtual points and reducing it as needed non-uniformly. Notice, when adaptive is on, the steps and optimize option are disabled.